What are you afraid of? We all dread something. Public speaking and heights are common fears. But what if you were terrified of those things along with fainting, closed spaces, germs, vomiting, and cheese? There's actually a name for that one, turophobia. If the mere thought of these things sent you into a panic, it would seem impossible to live a full and productive life. But the new book, My Age of Anxiety, disproves that theory. Its author, Scott Stossel, is the editor of The Atlantic and a Harvard graduate. He's also a married father of two. Welcome to Greater Boston.
Thank you for having me.
So, Scott, the day this book arrived on my desk, I started reading it, and I'm sure you've heard this before. I mean, you're a great writer, so you pulled me right into the story. I got so anxious. I started feeling panic. I've had a few in my life. I had to put it down. I mean, the scene in the bathroom, your wedding scene, I mean, you put humor into it, but really it's debilitating.
No, I've had a number of people say similar things, and so I actually wonder if it should come with an FDA. And I shouldn't say this because I'm trying to get people to buy the book, I hope it ultimately makes people feel better about their anxiety and feel less anxious, but I wonder if it should come with an FDA warning saying that it may cause panic attacks and weeping, and that maybe you should read it with a
absolutely. I mean,
a Valium in hand.
Almost everybody can identify with one of these things, a fear of flying or a repulsion to some kind of a food or phobias, about all kinds of things. But you have a lot. And I mean, and as I say, you have some humor about it, and you said you had it from the age of 2 and you've tried everything to get rid of it. Do you still have it? Has it subsided? Is it?
Yeah, no, as you say, I mean, starting from a very young age, I was sort of a neurotic, twitchy, phobic kid, and really around the age of about 6 or 7, I started developing acute separation anxiety, which is a normal developmental stage when you're 4, 5, 6 years old. But mine was particularly acute, and when it persists into 7, 8, 9, and then into teenage years, it's no longer a typical developmental stage, and is signs of an incipient anxiety disorder. And I had these sort of idiosyncratic phobias that set in around the same time.
Compulsive, obsessive behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have OCD. I do develop sort of obsessive thinking, fears about one of my longest standing and still most powerful phobias is emetophobia, which is the fear of vomiting.
I pulled that quote. I'm going to read it, if you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
Fear. I'm glad you said the way to say it, because I wasn't sure. So Scott writes, I struggle with emetophobia, a pathological fear of vomiting, but it's been a while since I last vomited. More than a while, to be precise, 35 years, 2 months, 4 days, 22 hours, 49 minutes. What this means is that I have spent, by rough calculation, at least 60% of my waking life thinking and worrying about something that I have spent 0% of the last 3 decades plus doing. This is irrational. Yes, it is.
Yes, it is. And I recognize that. And as I say in the book, I've been through generations of different kinds of therapists and hypnotists, and they all say, think about it reasonably. You spent all this time worrying about it, and partly in my, sort of anxiety-ridden, dysfunctional thought patterns, I think, well, maybe it's the fact of worrying that keeps it, wards it away, or that I'm germ phobic. And the therapist will then say, look, say the price of relaxing your vigilance a little bit was that maybe every couple of years you get a stomach virus and you get sick. Wouldn't that be worth the cost of getting so much of your life back? And I know that they're right, but this is sort of one of the characteristics of people who have severe phobias. For me, that's not the case.
But you can't even imagine, I mean, vomiting can be a great relief, frankly, if you've had too much to drink or
absolutely.
Something has upset your stomach. It's nothing I look forward to, but so you can't compartmentalize it that way.
I can intellectually and rationally. That makes total sense, and it's a normal human response that is designed to release toxins from your system that could poison you. And yet, when I am feeling sick to my stomach, and one of the symptoms of my anxiety is I tend to have a very nervous stomach, and then I get nervous about that, and then it can be very tiring and exhausting. Sort of chasing I get nervous, my stomach starts to hurt, I start to think, oh, am I sick? Then I start to worry about that, and then suddenly I'm off to the races.
So, what are you diagnosed with? Is it a mental disorder? What is it? And do you get any relief from any of these psychotropic drugs you've tried?
Yeah, I mean, and one of the things, sort of 2 answers to that question. I mean, one of the really interesting things that I struggle with in this book is anxiety, particularly pathological anxiety, just something that exists along a spectrum, and some people are more naturally anxious than others, but there's not necessarily a discrete point at which you pass over into a clinical disorder or some kind of pathology. Is it just, or is there actually, as you know, the DSM-3, which is the Bible, or now the DSM-5, which is the Bible of the American Psychiatric Association, says there are these discrete disorders, and those are, you know, post-traumatic stress disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and I've been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and some of these specific phobias. Yeah. And well, you have to kind of find the humor in the situation. Yeah. What has worked? I mean, I have a line in the piece where I sort of list this incredibly long litany of drugs that I've tried. I say what's worked, and I say nothing. The truth is that some things have worked very effectively for limited periods of time. For me, the first profound efflorescence of the anxiety was when I was in 7th grade, and I went to a new school, and for whatever constellation of factors, I was adolescent, it was new school, my phobias and fears just sort of totally metastasized, and I basically couldn't function, and was just lying one night in January of 1981 screaming on the floor, and my parents were thinking, oh my God, what do we do? Do we need to get a straitjacket and send them? So they ended up, I ended up being prescribed back then Thorazine, which was at the time fairly common for, they call it a major sedative, it's actually an antipsychotic, and dizipramine, which is or imipramine, which is an early tricyclic antidepressant, and also some benzodiazepines, Valium at the time, and that kind of helped get me through 7th and 8th grade, kept me out of the institution. Over the years, you know, since I'm 44, and I've been medicated on and off for much of the last, say, 34 years. So I've kind of been either the victim or the beneficiary of each class of drugs. Some of them definitely work some of the time in some ways, but there are people who are kind of ideological on both sides, and there are those who say that drugs actually make people worse. They cause the symptoms. At best, if they do work, they're just masking the symptoms and preventing you from dealing with the underlying distress. Well, I would say that actually for people who are severely anxious, it should be a part of the therapist's logic arsenal.
How does this play out with your wife and kids? I mean, obviously your wife is intimately familiar with you and how your mind is. She probably see what you're going through, but with the children, do they understand it?
Well, unfortunately, they understand it too well, because one of the fascinating things, again, about this book, so again, going to my emetophobia, I'd always assumed that I'd learned, well, I talk a lot in the book about the genetics, you know, how much of it is nature and how much of it is nurture, and I'd always assumed that I'd learned my emetophobia from watching my mom, who had it. So then I thought, well, I'm going to I was at great pains to conceal it from my kids. And then all of a sudden, when my daughter was 7, the exact same age when I developed it, she developed it very, very acutely. So at that point, we sort of talked about it, yeah, that was sort of heartbreaking and fascinating at the same time.
It's a great book. I hate to say I loved it, but I really enjoyed reading it, even though it gave me anxiety too. Scott Stossel, thanks so much for coming.
Well, it's been my pleasure.